No one stays here past sunset, Ethan Cole said. Yet 6 days later, he would stand at his own gate and forget how to close it. The wind dragged a thin ribbon of dust across the yard, curling around fence posts that hadn't seen fresh paint in years, and Ethan watched it the way a man watches time pass, when there's nothing left to measure it by. His ranch sat 30 miles from the nearest town, a stretch of hard ground and stubborn grass, where cattle learned to survive or didn't, and where a man could disappear without anyone asking why. And that had been the point when he came out here a decade ago with one horse, a broken saddle, and rules he never wrote down but never broke. The first one being simple enough to remember even on bad days. No strangers, no exceptions, no stories that weren't his to carry. The sun leaned low, throwing long shadows through the slats of the barn. When he saw her coming, a single figure moving steady along the dirt track like she'd measured every mile before she took it. Not rushing, not slowing, just closing the distance with a kind of quiet certainty that made the place feel smaller than it was. She wore a dust-colored dress that caught the light in soft earth tones, hair dark and straight with small braids that shifted in the breeze. And when she reached the gate, she didn't touch it right away, just rested her hand on the wood as if asking the land itself for permission. Ethan stepped onto the porch, boots creaking against boards that had heard more silence than voices, and he let the space between them hold for a second longer than most men would, because out here, hesitation was sometimes the only thing that kept you honest. "You lost?" he asked, not unkind, just exact. Her eyes met his, steady and dark, and there was no fear in them, no plea, only a calm that didn't belong to people who wandered without purpose. 6 days, she said, voice low, shaped by a different kind of road. "I'll work. Then I leave." He almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded like a bargain made in a place that didn't trade in them. The wind shifted, carrying the dry scent of hay and sun-warmed leather, and he noticed her hands, worn, a faint cut along one knuckle. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of mark that comes from doing what needs doing. "Not a boarding house," he said, eyes drifting past her to the empty horizon, the way a man checks for trouble even when none has ever come. She nodded once, like she'd expected that answer, and didn't step back. Something in that stillness, no argument, no retreat, pressed against the rule he'd kept for so long it felt like part of the fence line. A crow called from the far post, sharp and brief, then quiet again. 6 days, she repeated, softer this time, not pushing, just placing the words where they could be taken or left. Ethan looked at the gate, at the simple latch he could lift with 2 fingers, the line between what was his and what wasn't, and for a moment he saw it the way other men might, a boundary that kept things out, or kept something in. He stepped down from the porch, boots crunching over gravel, and stopped an arm's length away, close enough to see the sun-warmed tone of her skin, the way dust had settled along the hem of her dress, the small turquoise pendant resting at her collarbone like it had always belonged there. "Name?" he asked. "Lena," she said. Then after a beat, "Redbird." The name sat in the air between them, not heavy, just present. Ethan reached for the latch, paused, then lifted it, the wood giving a soft, familiar sound that echoed farther than it should have. The gate opened a few inches, enough for a person to pass if they chose to. 6 days, he said, stepping aside without looking at her again, as if the act meant less if he didn't watch it happen. She moved through the opening with that same measured pace, neither quick nor slow, and the wind carried a faint shift in the dust behind her like the land itself had taken note. Somewhere in the distance, a loose board tapped against a post, a quiet rhythm that didn't quite match the way things usually sounded out here. Ethan closed the gate halfway, not all the way, just enough to say something had changed even if he couldn't yet name it. And as Lena set her small bundle near the porch and turned toward the barn like she'd already learned the layout, he felt a thin line inside him pull tight. Not fear, not regret, just the sense that a clock he hadn't known was there had started counting down, one day at a time, towards something the wind refused to explain. The first night passed without a word between them, just the quiet exchange of presence, and by morning Ethan realized something was off before he even stepped outside, the kind of off that did not shout but settled into the air like a question you could not ignore. The horses were already fed, the water trough filled to the brim, without a single spill. And the gate he had left half open was now closed just enough to keep the wind from rattling it. Not fully latched, just understood. He stood there for a moment, boots still on the threshold, scanning the yard as if expecting to find a mistake. But there was none, only the faint trace of fresh footprints pressed into the dirt, small, steady, deliberate. Lena was by the barn, sleeves rolled just past her elbows, moving slow and precise as she checked a loose hinge that had been bothering him for weeks. Her hands working without hesitation like she had done this 100 times before, and that was the first thing that unsettled him. Not what she did, but how little she needed to ask. Most people who passed through places like this brought noise with them, questions, explanations, reasons that felt heavier than truth. But she carried none of that, only quiet and a rhythm that seemed to fit into the ranch as if it had been waiting for her. By midday the sun pressed down hard, baking the earth into that familiar cracked pattern that spoke of long summers and short mercy. And Ethan found himself watching her without meaning to, noticing the way she paused at the edge of the yard every so often, always facing west, never turning her back to it, like that direction held something that had not arrived yet but would. He told himself it was nothing, just habit, just the way some people track the sun or the wind, but it stayed with him longer than it should have. "You work like you have been here before," he said at one point, not looking directly at her, keeping his voice neutral, the way a man does when he is testing the weight of something. She did not stop what she was doing, just tightened the hinge and wiped her hands on a cloth before answering. "Places like this, they do not change much." And that was all. No story, no past offered up to fill the silence. Just enough words to keep the air from closing in completely. The afternoon stretched on, heat rising in waves off the ground, and somewhere beyond the ridge a hawk circled slow and patient, its shadow gliding across the land like a quiet warning no one had asked for. Ethan checked the fence line out of habit, boots kicking up dust with every step, and when he reached the far post, he stopped, not because something was broken, but because something had been there and was now gone. A set of faint tracks near the outer edge, not cattle, not his own, something lighter, something that had approached and then turned away, leaving no clear direction behind. He crouched, ran his fingers over the marks, and felt that same tight line pull inside his chest again, the one that had started the moment she walked through his gate. When he came back, the light had shifted, long shadows stretching across the yard, and Lena was sitting on the porch, not resting, not tired, just waiting, her gaze fixed on that western horizon like it held a promise she had already accepted. He followed her line of sight, saw nothing but distance and fading light. Yet the silence between them felt different now, heavier, as if the ranch itself was listening. "You expecting someone?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could decide whether it mattered. She did not look at him, just shook her head once, slow and certain. "No," she said. Then after a pause that lingered longer than the word itself, "They are expecting me." And that was the moment Ethan understood, not fully, not clearly, but enough to know that whatever had stepped onto his land was not just passing through, and whatever was coming was already on its way. The second morning did not begin with sound. It began with absence, the kind that settles into a place so quietly you only notice it when something familiar fails to happen, and Ethan felt it before his eyes even opened, that subtle shift in the air that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. He stepped outside and stopped on the porch again, same as the day before, but this time the stillness was deeper, heavier, as if the land itself had decided to listen. Lena was already awake, already moving, but not working, not fixing or feeding or mending like she had done the day before. Instead, she stood near the fence line facing west, arms relaxed at her sides, eyes steady on the horizon, and for a long moment she did not move at all, not even when the wind brushed past her, not even when a loose board tapped against the post behind her. Ethan watched from a distance, something in his chest tightening again, not fear, not yet, but recognition of a pattern he did not understand. He walked out toward the barn, boots pressing into the dirt with slow, measured steps, and as he passed her, he noticed something new, something small but impossible to ignore. Her footprints from the day before had been smoothed over, not by wind, not by chance, but by intention, like she had erased where she had been, leaving no trace behind except the present moment. "You planning on staying invisible out here?" he said, keeping his tone even. But there was a weight behind the words now, a question that carried more than it should. She turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough for him to see the edge of her expression, calm, unreadable. "Only where it matters," she said, then looked back toward the horizon as if the conversation had already ended. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning chill, and the ranch returned to its usual rhythm, cattle shifting slowly in the distance, the creak of wood, the whisper of wind through dry grass. But Ethan could not shake the feeling that something had changed beneath it all, like a second layer of time had settled over the first. By noon he found himself walking the outer fence again, not because anything was broken, but because he needed to see it with his own eyes, to confirm that what he felt had a shape, a form, something real. When he reached the far ridge, he stopped again, this time longer, because the tracks from yesterday were gone, not faded, not scattered, gone completely, as if whatever had approached had never touched the ground at all. He stood there for a while, the heat pressing down on his shoulders, the horizon stretching endless and empty in front of him. And for the first time in years, he felt the land shift from something he owned into something he did not fully understand. When he returned, Lena was sitting on the porch again. Same place as the night before, same stillness, but now there was something else, a faint line drawn in the dirt at her feet. Not random, not careless, a simple mark that ran parallel to the horizon like a quiet boundary. He slowed as he approached, eyes fixed on that line. "What is that?" he asked, and she did not answer right away, just traced the edge of it once with her finger before looking up at him. "A reminder," she said, voice low, steady, "that some things do not cross until they are called." And then she stood, brushing the dust from her hands, and walked past him without another word, leaving Ethan alone on the porch, staring at a line in the dirt that should not have meant anything, but somehow did, because as the sun began to fall again, he realized the silence had not lifted, it had only deepened, and whatever was waiting beyond that horizon was not just coming closer. It was already close enough to feel. By the third day, the ranch no longer felt like it belonged to one man, not because anything had been taken, but because something unseen had begun to settle into its edges, the kind of presence that does not announce itself but makes every small sound feel deliberate. Ethan woke before sunrise, not out of habit, but because the silence had grown too thick to sleep through, and when he stepped outside, the air felt colder than it should have been for that time of year, a dry chill that carried. No wind, no movement, just stillness stretched across the land like a held breath. Lena was not on the porch this time, and for a moment that absence struck him harder than anything he had seen so far, because she had been there every morning, same place, same direction, like a fixed point he had not realized he was relying on. He moved across the yard, slower than usual, eyes scanning the barn, the fence line, the ridge beyond, until he found her standing near the far post, farther out than she had gone before, closer to that invisible boundary she seemed to track without marking. She was not working, not watching, just standing with her head slightly tilted as if listening to something too distant for him to hear. "You keep stepping further out," he said, voice low but steady, and she did not turn this time, only answered after a pause that stretched just long enough to feel intentional. "So do they," she said. The words settled between them, simple, but heavier than they should have been, and Ethan felt that same tight line pull again, sharper now, more defined, like a warning he could not yet translate. The sun broke over the horizon, light spilling across the land in slow, deliberate bands, and for a brief second, the entire ranch seemed to glow with a kind of clarity that made every detail stand out, the cracks in the wood, the lines in the dirt, the faint edges of something that had not been there before, or maybe had been and he had just never seen it. He followed her gaze again, out toward the west, and this time he noticed it, not movement, not shape, just a subtle distortion in the distance, like heat rising off stone, except the air was too cool for that, too still. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the same empty horizon he had known for years. "You expecting them today?" he asked, and this time she turned fully, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that felt final in a way he could not explain. "No," she said, Then after a breath that carried more weight than the word itself. But they are closer. And something in the way she said it made Ethan realize that distance did not mean miles. Not in the way she understood it. The day moved forward, but slower than before. Each hour stretching longer than it should. The work feeling lighter, but the air feeling heavier. And even the cattle seemed quieter, shifting less, grazing without the usual restless movement that marked the rhythm of the ranch. By afternoon, Ethan found himself checking the same places again. The fence, the gate, the ridge, but not out of routine anymore. Out of something else, something closer to anticipation, though he could not say what he was anticipating. When he returned to the house, Lena was back on the porch, seated in the same spot as before, the line in the dirt still visible at her feet, untouched, undisturbed. And as he stepped closer, he noticed something new, something that made him stop without realizing it. The dust just beyond that line had shifted, not scattered, not erased, but pressed, as if something had come right up to it and chosen not to cross. He crouched, reaching out without thinking, but stopped just short of the mark, his hand hovering in the air as if crossing that space required permission he did not have. They were here, he said, more to himself than to her, and Lena nodded once, calm, certain. They always come before they arrive, she said, and as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard and stopped, just short of that line, Ethan realized that whatever was coming was no longer distant, no longer uncertain. It was already at the edge of his land, waiting, just like she was, for something he had not yet done. The fourth day did not arrive with the sun. It arrived with a feeling Ethan could not place, like waking up inside a memory that was not his, where everything looked the same, but carried a weight that did not belong. He stepped outside and stopped immediately, because the line in the dirt was gone, not erased, not brushed away, but absorbed into the ground as if it had never been drawn, and in its place the earth looked smoother, quieter, like it had settled after something unseen had passed over it. Lena was standing at the edge of the yard again, closer than before, her posture unchanged, calm, steady, but there was something different now, not in how she stood, but in how the space around her seemed to hold still, as if even the wind had decided not to move past her. Ethan walked forward slowly, boots pressing into the soil that felt firmer than it should have been, and as he reached the place where the line had been, he felt it, not a barrier, not something solid, but a shift, like stepping from one thought into another without realizing when it changed. He paused, looking down, then back up at her. "You said they do not cross until they are called," he said, voice quieter than usual. "So what happens when the line disappears?" She did not turn right away, just kept her eyes on the horizon, and for the first time since she arrived, there was something in her stillness that felt heavier, not uncertain, but final. "It means the waiting is almost done," she said. And the words settled deeper than anything she had said before. The ranch felt different after that. Not louder, not busier, just more aware, like every post, every board, every stretch of land had begun to listen more closely to something beyond it. Ethan tried to move through his day the way he always had, checking the cattle, repairing a loose section of fence, filling the trough, but each task felt like it was being done under watch, not by eyes he could see, but by something that understood the rhythm of the place better than he did. By midday, the sky had turned that pale, endless blue that usually brought a sense of calm, but today it only made the horizon feel sharper, closer, like the distance between here and there had narrowed without warning. He found Lena near the barn, her hands resting lightly against the wood, eyes closed for just a second, as if she was listening again, not to the land this time, but to something moving through it. "You hear them?" he asked. And this time she opened her eyes and looked directly at him. No distance, no silence between them, just clarity. "Not with ears," she said, and there was no need to explain further. The afternoon stretched longer than it should have, shadows moving slower, the air growing thicker with each passing hour, and Ethan noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore. The animals had begun to gather closer to the center of the ranch, not restless, not afraid, just present, as if they too felt the edge of something approaching and chose to remain within a space they understood. As the sun lowered, casting gold across the land, Ethan stood near the gate, the same gate he had opened 4 days ago without thinking, and now it felt heavier than it ever had, not in weight, but in meaning. He reached out, fingers brushing the wood, and for the first time, he did not think about keeping things out. He thought about what might be waiting to come in. Behind him, Lena stepped onto the porch, her movement quiet but certain, and he did not need to turn to know she was there. Tomorrow, he asked, not because he needed confirmation, but because the question had already formed inside him. She did not answer immediately, and when she did, her voice was softer than before, but carried something that felt like truth in its simplest form. Soon, she said, and as the last light slipped below the horizon, leaving the land in that brief moment between day and night, Ethan realized that whatever was coming was no longer approaching from a distance. It was already here, just beyond sight, waiting for something as simple and as difficult as a man deciding whether to stand his ground or step aside. The 5th day did not begin with silence. It began with sound that should not have been there, a low, distant hum carried across the land like something breathing just beyond hearing. And Ethan woke with it already inside his chest, not loud, not sharp, just present in a way that made everything else feel slightly out of place. He stepped outside before the light fully broke, and for the first time since Lena arrived, the horizon did not look empty. It looked occupied, not by shapes or figures, but by a weight that pressed against the edge of sight, as if the distance itself had thickened. The air felt warmer than it should have, though the sun had not yet risen, and the ground beneath his boots carried a faint vibration, so subtle it could have been imagined, but steady enough that it refused to be dismissed. Lena was already at the gate, not near it, not beside it, but standing directly in front of it, her hand resting lightly on the wood as if she could feel something moving through it. She did not look back when he approached, did not need to, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but clearer. "They are here," she said. Ethan followed her gaze, eyes narrowing against the dim light, and for a moment he saw nothing. Then something shifted, not movement, but alignment, like the horizon had drawn a line he had never noticed before, and along that line the air bent just enough to suggest presence. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself without knowing why. "How many?" he asked, and the question felt smaller than it should have been. Lena shook her head once, not dismissing the question, but reshaping it. "Enough," she said, and there was no fear in her voice, only certainty. The sun rose slowly, light spreading across the land, revealing the same ranch, the same fences, the same worn boards and open sky, but none of it felt untouched anymore, as if something had already crossed into it without leaving a mark. The cattle had gathered closer again, tighter than the day before, their movements slow, deliberate, as if guided by an instinct older than habit. And even the wind had changed, no longer moving freely across the yard, but circling, contained, like it too had chosen a boundary. Ethan walked to the gate, standing beside Lena now, close enough to feel the calm in her stillness, a calm that did not come from ignorance, but from knowing exactly what was happening. "You said they do not cross until they are called," he said, his voice lower now, more grounded. "So who calls them?" Lena finally turned, her eyes meeting his fully, and for the first time, there was something in them that reflected him, not as a stranger, not as a host, but as part of the moment itself. "You do," she said. The words did not land like a demand or a warning. They settled like truth, simple and unchangeable, and Ethan felt the weight of them move through him, not heavy, but exact. He looked at the gate, at the latch, at the piece of wood that had separated his world from everything else for years, and for a brief moment, he remembered why he had built that distance, why he had kept it, why he had believed it mattered. Behind him, the ranch stood quiet, not empty, not abandoned, just waiting, and ahead of him, the horizon held its shape, that subtle bend in the air now clearer, more defined, as if something stood just beyond it, patient, unmoving. Ethan reached out, fingers wrapping around the latch, and paused, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that this was the moment the days had been counting toward, 1 through 5, each step leading here. Lena did not speak again, did not move. She simply stood beside him, present, steady, and as the light grew stronger, casting long lines across the ground that all pointed toward the gate, Ethan realized that the choice was not about letting something in, it was about deciding whether he was still the man who needed to keep everything out, and somewhere beyond the visible edge of the land, something waited, not pushing forward, not retreating, just standing in perfect stillness, as if it already knew what he would do. The moment stretched longer than it should have, the kind of moment that does not pass with time but deepens with it, and Ethan's hand remained on the latch, not gripping tighter, not pulling away, just resting there as if the wood itself was waiting for his decision. The low hum that had filled the morning did not grow louder, but it grew clearer, no longer something distant, but something present, like a rhythm shared between the land and whatever stood beyond it. He looked out again, and this time the horizon did not blur or bend. It revealed, not in shapes or bodies, but in alignment, as if the space itself had chosen to show that it was no longer empty. Lena stood beside him without moving, her calm unchanged. But there was something else now, something almost like relief, not for herself, but for the moment finally arriving the way it was meant to. "If I open it," Ethan said, his voice steady but lower than before, "they come through." And it was not a question, it was a statement shaped by everything he had seen and everything he had not yet understood. Lena nodded once, slow, certain. "If you open it, you stop holding them back," she said. The words settled deeper than anything else, because they shifted the meaning of the gate entirely, not a barrier, not a defense, but something he had been maintaining without realizing what it was keeping in place. Ethan let out a breath he did not know he had been holding, and, for a brief second, the world seemed to narrow to that single point, his hand, the latch, the line between what had been and what would follow. He did not rush it, did not force it. He simply lifted, and the latch gave with a soft, familiar sound that echoed farther than it should have, carrying across the yard, across the fence line, across the distance itself. The gate moved, not wide, not dramatic, just enough, a few inches, the same way it had opened for her, but this time it felt different, heavier in meaning, lighter in resistance. Nothing rushed in, nothing crossed immediately, and that was the first thing that struck him, the absence of urgency, the patience of whatever waited beyond. The hum faded, not disappearing, but settling, like something acknowledging that its turn had come. Ethan stepped back, just one step, not retreating, not yielding, just making space, and beside him, Lena moved forward, passing through the gate with the same measured pace she had used when she arrived. But this time she did not stop on the other side. She continued a few steps further, turning to face the horizon fully, her posture straight, grounded, like she had reached the place she had been moving toward since the beginning. The light shifted again, not brighter, not darker, but clearer, and in that clarity, Ethan saw it. Not forms, not faces, but presence, layered, quiet, filling the space beyond the gate without crossing it yet. Lena raised her hand slightly, not high, not signaling, just enough to mark the moment, and the land responded in a way that could not be seen but could be felt, a soft release, like tension leaving something that had been held too long. Then, slowly, without sound, without force, the first step came from beyond, not toward him, not into the ranch, but forward into the space that had been opened, and Ethan understood then that this was not an arrival, not an intrusion, but a crossing that required permission not from words, but from choice. He stood there, watching, not as a man defending his land, but as someone witnessing something older than ownership, older than fear, and as the stillness deepened around him, he realized that nothing had been taken from him, nothing had been broken, only something had been allowed to continue, something that had been waiting for him to stop standing in its way. Nothing rushed in, nothing claimed the land, and that was what unsettled Ethan the most, because every instinct he had built over the years had prepared him for force, for intrusion, for something that demanded space. But what stood beyond the gate did none of that. It waited, patient, measured, as if time itself had slowed to match its pace. Lena remained just past the threshold, not turning back, not stepping further, simply standing where the space between both sides felt balanced, and for a long moment, nothing changed, yet everything had already shifted, The presence beyond the gate did not move as one. It unfolded, subtle, like layers of distance stepping forward without crossing, and Ethan realized he was not looking at people the way he understood them. He was witnessing something that existed between movement and stillness, something that respected the line even after it had been opened. He took another step back, not out of fear, but because the space no longer belonged to him alone, and the ranch, his ranch, no longer felt like a place defined by ownership, but by something older, something that had been there long before he built fences or rules. The cattle did not scatter. They remained calm, heads low, breathing steady, as if whatever stood beyond the gate was not a threat, but a return, and even the wind shifted, moving gently through the open space, carrying a scent Ethan could not name, not dust, not hay, something deeper, something that felt like memory. Lena lowered her hand slowly, and with that small motion, the presence beyond responded, not by advancing, but by settling, like a tide choosing its level. Ethan watched, eyes narrowing, not in suspicion, but in focus, trying to understand what he was being shown, and for the first time since she arrived, he realized that this had never been about her staying. It had always been about him learning to step aside. "They are not coming for the land," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. And Lena's voice followed, calm, certain. "They are not coming for anything you can lose," she said. The words lifted something inside him, something he had carried for years without naming it. And in that moment, he understood that what he had been protecting was not the land, not the cattle, not the quiet, but a version of himself that believed distance was the only way to remain whole. The horizon no longer felt far. It felt present, close enough to touch without needing to move, and the space between both sides held steady, not collapsing, not expanding, just existing as it was meant to. Ethan looked down at the gate, now open just enough, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to close it, did not feel the urge to restore what had been, because what had been no longer fit the shape of what he was seeing. Behind him, the ranch remained unchanged in form, but changed in meaning. Every board, every post, every stretch of ground now part of something larger than a man's claim. Lena finally turned her head, slightly, not fully toward him, just enough to acknowledge that the moment had shifted, and in her eyes there was no urgency, no expectation, only a quiet understanding that what needed to happen had already begun. The presence beyond the gate did not press forward. It remained where it was, respectful, waiting, and Ethan realized that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a balance he had never known, one that did not ask him to give up what was his, only to understand that it had never been his alone. The silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It was fuller, deeper, and as he stood there between the open gate and the endless horizon, Ethan Cole understood that the land had not changed. He had, and whatever came next would not be decided by fear, but by how long he was willing to remain where he stood, without closing the gate again. The space between them held steady, but it did not remain empty. It deepened, like a quiet agreement settling into the ground itself, and Ethan began to notice things he would have missed before, small shifts that carried more meaning than movement ever could. The light did not just fall across the land anymore. It seemed to rest on it, softer, more deliberate, as if it had chosen where to linger, and the air no longer pressed against his chest. It moved through him, slow and even, like the land had exhaled after holding something too long. Lena stood just beyond the gate, still facing the horizon, but now her posture had changed in a way that was almost impossible to see unless you knew what had come before. She was no longer waiting. She was present, fully, completely, as if the place she stood in had accepted her not as a visitor, but as something that belonged. Ethan remained where he was, one step behind the gate, not crossing, not retreating, just holding the position that now felt less like a boundary and more like a bridge. And as he watched, the presence beyond shifted again, not forward, not closer, but clearer, like a reflection sharpening in still water. He could not count them, could not define them, but he could feel them, not as a threat, not as an intrusion, but as something that carried weight without pressure, presence without demand. A breeze moved through the yard, gentle, steady, and with it came that same unfamiliar scent, deeper now, layered, like earth after rain, even though the sky had been clear for days, and Ethan realized that what he was sensing was not new. It had always been there. He had just never allowed himself to feel it. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quieter. Not because he was unsure, but because the moment called for it. Lena did not answer right away, and when she did not turn, did not gesture. She simply spoke as if the answer had always been part of the land itself. "Now they remember," she said. The words did not explain, but they resonated, settling into something inside him that did not need translation. Ethan looked back across the ranch, at the barn, the fence line, the long stretch of land he had shaped with his own hands, and for the first time, he saw it not as something he had built alone, but as something that had been waiting for him to understand it differently. The cattle lifted their heads briefly, not startled, not alarmed, just aware, then returned to grazing, as if acknowledging a change that did not disturb their place within it. The horizon no longer felt like an edge. It felt like a continuation, and the open gate no longer marked a division. It marked a connection, something simple, something that had required nothing more than a man choosing not to close it. Lena took one step forward, not away from him, but into the space that had been opened, and as she did, the presence beyond responded again, not advancing, not crossing, but aligning, like pieces of something long separated, finding their place without force. Ethan watched, steady, grounded, and in that moment, he understood that this was not an ending, not a resolution, but a return, not for the land, not for her, but for something within himself that had been waiting longer than he had realized. The silence settled again, but this time it was not empty. It was full, carrying meaning without words, and as the light shifted once more, casting long, quiet lines across the ground, Ethan Cole stood between what he had been and what he was becoming, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to choose between them, because the land had already chosen for him, simply by remaining exactly as it had always been, open, patient, and waiting for someone to finally see it clearly. The stillness did not break. It evolved, settling into something that felt less like waiting and more like understanding. And Ethan found himself standing differently, without realizing when it changed, his weight no longer leaning back toward the ranch, but balanced between what he had known and what he was beginning to see. The presence beyond the gate did not advance, yet it became clearer, not in form, but in intention, as if the land itself was translating something that had never needed words. Lena remained where she stood, no longer at the edge of anything, but within it, and for the first time, Ethan understood that she had not come to ask for space. She had come to show him what space truly meant. The light shifted again, softer now, stretching across the ground in long, quiet lines that no longer stopped at the gate, but moved through it, connecting both sides without distinction, and in that light, the ranch looked the same, yet entirely different, as if its purpose had widened without changing its shape. Ethan lowered his hand from the gate, not because he was done, but because there was nothing left to hold, and as he did, the subtle tension that had lived in his shoulders for years began to ease, not all at once, but enough to notice. He stepped forward, just one step, crossing the place where he had always stopped, and the ground beneath his boots felt no different, no resistance, no shift, just earth, steady and unchanged, and that was what made it matter. The cattle lifted their heads again, not startled, not alert, just aware, then settled once more, as if confirming what he had begun to understand. The air carried that same unfamiliar scent, but now it felt familiar in a way he could not explain, like something remembered rather than discovered. "They remember," he said quietly, repeating her words. And this time he did not question them. He felt them. Lena turned toward him then, fully, and for the first time since she arrived, her expression held something new, not distance, not stillness, but recognition, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally reached its shape. "And now you do too," she said. The words did not change the land. They changed him, settling into a place inside him that had been closed for longer than he cared to measure. Ethan looked out again, beyond the gate, beyond the horizon, and what he saw was not something arriving, but something that had always been there, something he had finally allowed himself to stand beside instead of apart from. The presence beyond did not need to move closer. It was already as close as it needed to be, and the ranch, his ranch, no longer felt like a boundary drawn against the world, but a part of it, connected in a way that required nothing more than awareness. Lena took another step, not away, not toward, just within, and the space around her seemed to settle in response, as if acknowledging that what had been divided was no longer held that way. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but the feeling unmistakable, and as the light continued to stretch across the land, he realized that nothing had been taken from him, nothing had been given to him. Only something had been revealed, something simple, something quiet, something that had been waiting not for time, but for him to finally see it. And in that moment, standing with the gate open behind him and the horizon open before him, Ethan Cole understood that the land had never asked him to change, only to stop holding it apart from what it had always been. The light lingered longer than it should have, stretched across the land in a way that made time feel less like a sequence and more like a presence. And Ethan stood within it, no longer measuring moments by what came next, but by what had already settled into place. The open gate behind him no longer called for attention. It simply existed, quiet, unguarded, as if it had always been meant to remain that way. Lena moved slowly across the yard, not leaving, not arriving, just walking as someone does when there is no longer a distance to close, her steps light against the earth that seemed to receive them without sound. The presence beyond the horizon did not fade, but it did not press forward either. It remained where it was, steady, patient, as if the need to move had never belonged to it. Ethan watched her for a moment, then turned his gaze back across the ranch, seeing it now with a clarity that did not come from sight alone, but from something quieter, something that had shifted inside him without force. The barn stood as it always had, weathered with catching the last stretch of sun, the fence lines tracing their familiar paths across the land, and the cattle moving in slow, steady patterns that no longer felt isolated, but part of something wider. He stepped further out, not following Lena, not leaving anything behind, just moving because there was no reason not to, and the ground beneath him held firm, unchanged, reminding him that nothing essential had been altered, only understood. The air carried that same scent again, not strange anymore, not distant, but present in a way that felt like it had always belonged here, like something he had once known and forgotten. Lena stopped near the center of the yard, turning slightly, her gaze meeting his without urgency, without expectation, and in that look there was no question, only acknowledgement. "You see it now," she said, her voice quiet, but certain. Ethan nodded once, not because he could explain it, but because he no longer needed to, and the weight of that realization settled into him with a calm he had not felt in years. The horizon stretched endlessly, but it no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a continuation, something that did not divide but connected, and the presence beyond it remained, not distant, not close, simply there, as it had always been. The wind moved gently through the open gate, carrying dust and light in equal measure, and Ethan noticed how it no longer circled or held back. It moved freely now, as if the space had been returned to itself. Lena took a slow breath, then another, and there was a subtle shift in her posture, not retreat, not departure, but completion, like a task that had reached its end without needing to be named. Ethan felt it too, not as a change in the land, but as a quiet settling, something that had been waiting now at rest. He looked at her, then at the gate, then back to the horizon, and for the first time, none of it felt separate, none of it required him to choose where he belonged. "What happens to you?" he asked, the words coming softer than he intended, not from doubt, but from a place that had only just opened. Lena did not answer right away, and when she did, her voice carried no distance, no mystery, only truth in its simplest form. "I was never apart from this," she said, and the meaning did not need explanation. The sun dipped lower, light softening across the land, and the long shadows that followed no longer stopped at lines or edges. They stretched across everything, blending one space into another. Ethan stood there, not as a man guarding what was his, but as someone finally standing where he had always been meant to. And as the quiet settled fully into the ranch, he understood that nothing had been taken, Nothing had been given. Only something had been remembered, and it would remain long after the moment passed, because it had never depended on him to begin with. The evening did not fall the way it used to. It unfolded slowly, like something choosing to remain rather than disappear, and Ethan stood in that lingering light with a stillness that no longer felt forced, no longer something he had to maintain, but something that had settled into him as naturally as breath. The ranch stretched quiet around him, not empty, not silent, but full in a way that did not need sound to be understood. Every board, every fence post, every inch of ground holding its place, without resistance, as if the land itself had reached a kind of rest. Lena remained near the center of the yard, not moving away, not preparing to leave, but standing in a way that felt complete, like a circle closed without needing to be drawn. The presence beyond the horizon had not faded, yet it no longer held his attention the way it had before, because it no longer felt separate from where he stood. It was part of the same quiet, the same balance, the same understanding that had taken shape across these days. Ethan walked slowly toward the porch, each step measured but not heavy, his boots pressing into the same ground he had walked for years. Yet the weight of each step felt different, not burdened, not guarded, just placed where it needed to be. He paused near the doorway, turning slightly to look back, and for a moment, the entire ranch seemed to hold its breath again, not in tension, but in recognition of what had been set into motion and what had now come to rest. Lena's gaze shifted toward him, not calling, not stopping him, simply acknowledging that he was no longer standing where he had been before. "You will keep it open," she said, her voice calm, not a question, not a request, but a simple reflection of what already was. Ethan looked at the gate, still open behind him, the latch hanging loose against the wood, and for the first time, he did not think about closing it, did not feel the pull of old habits or the weight of old reasons, because those reasons had lost their shape the moment he understood what the gate had truly been. "It was never mine to close," he said quietly, and the truth of it did not feel like loss. It felt like release. The wind moved through again, steady and unbroken, carrying dust and light across the yard, through the gate, and out toward the horizon without hesitation, and Ethan noticed how nothing resisted it anymore. Not the fence, not the land, not even himself. Lena took a slow step back, not retreating, not leaving, but shifting her place within the space that now held both sides as one, and there was no need for explanation, no need for farewell, because whatever she had come to do had already been done. The lights softened further, dipping into that quiet moment between day and night where everything feels suspended, and in that suspension, Ethan realized that nothing more needed to happen, no final act, no closing gesture, only the continuation of what had already begun. He stepped onto the porch, turning once more to look out across the land, and what he saw was not change, but clarity. The same ranch, the same horizon, the same sky, all of it exactly as it had always been, only now seen without the distance he had once placed between himself and everything else. Lena remained where she was, still, grounded, and as the last light faded, her presence did not disappear. It settled, like something returning to where it had always belonged, leaving no absence behind, only a quiet fullness that filled the space she had occupied. Ethan stood there for a long moment, not waiting, not expecting, just present. And as the first stars began to appear above the open sky, he understood that the days had not been about change, they had been about remembering. And now that remembering had taken hold, it would not leave, because it had never been something that could be taken away, only something that could be seen or ignored, and he had finally chosen to see. The night settled in without taking anything away. It simply revealed what daylight had been too bright to show, and Ethan remained on the porch long after the last color drained from the sky, not because he was waiting, but because for the first time, there was nothing left to hold against the quiet. The gate stood open behind him, unmoving, no longer a question, no longer a decision, just a part of the land the way it had always been before he gave it meaning it did not need. The stars came out one by one, steady and distant, yet closer than they had ever felt, and the horizon, once a line he watched for change, now rested like a promise that did not need to be kept because it had never been broken. He looked out across the ranch, seeing every detail the same as it had been the day before, the barn worn but standing, the fence stretching in long, familiar lines, the cattle resting where they always had, and yet none of it felt like something he owned anymore. It felt like something he belonged to. The air moved through him without resistance, carrying that same quiet scent that no longer needed a name, and in it was something steady, something patient, something that had outlasted every reason he had ever built for standing apart. He stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the center of the yard, not searching, not following, just moving within a space that no longer asked him to choose where to stand. Lena was no longer there in the way she had been, not as a figure, not as a presence he could point to, but there was no absence either, only a sense that what she had carried had been set down, not lost, not gone, just returned to where it had always belonged. He paused where she had once stood, the ground unchanged beneath his boots, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to remember, but to feel. And what he felt was not emptiness, it was fullness, a quiet that held everything it needed without asking for more. The ranch breathed around him, slow and even, and he realized that the hum he had heard before had not vanished. It had become part of everything, woven into the wind, into the earth, into the steady rhythm of a place that did not need to be claimed to be understood. He opened his eyes and turned toward the gate, still open, still waiting, and he walked to it without hesitation, not to close it, not to guard it, but to stand beside it the way a man stands beside something he respects rather than controls. Beyond it, the horizon stretched wide and clear, no longer hiding anything, no longer asking him to imagine what might be there, because what mattered was already here. He rested his hand lightly on the wood, feeling its rough surface, familiar and honest, and for the first time, it felt like part of something larger than his own decisions. The wind passed through again, steady, unbroken, and carried with it a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken, that nothing had been taken from him, nothing had been given, only something had been returned, something that had never belonged to distance or fear, only to presence. Ethan Cole stood there as the night deepened, not as a man who had changed the land, but as one who had finally stopped standing apart from it. And in that stillness, with the gate open and the horizon endless, he understood that out here, justice did not need a gun, it did not need a voice, it only needed a man willing to step aside and let what was right remain exactly as it was.